What would you do if someone you loved told you they saw demons? What if they said those demons had possessed your children? What if they believed it so deeply that they acted on it? These aren't hypothetical questions. On March 11, 2003, in a small apartment in Brownsville, Texas, a father answered them in the most horrific way imaginable. 3 children lost their lives that night. Julissa, 4 years old, John, 3, Mary Jane, just 14 months. And for more than 2 decades, the legal system has wrestled with a question that still haunts this border community. When mental illness and murder collide, where does justice begin, and where does it end? This is a story about a crime so brutal, some couldn't believe it was real. But it's also a story about something we don't want to talk about. What happens when someone who is clearly mentally ill commits an unforgivable act? Do we execute them? Do we treat them? Can we do both? Texas has answered that question 588 times since 1976. 588 executions, more than any other state in America. John Allen Rubio may soon be number 589. But before we can understand his fate, we need to understand his story, and it begins here, in Brownsville, the southernmost city in Texas, where the American dream meets the Rio Grande. If you've never been to Brownsville, here's what you need to know. It's hot, it's humid, and it's one of the poorest cities in the United States. 60% of children here live below the poverty line. The median household income is nearly half the national average. Jobs are scarce, opportunities limited. But ask anyone who lives here what defines Brownsville, and they won't talk about statistics. They'll talk about familiar, family, community, the unbreakable bonds that hold people together when everything else falls apart. It's a place where neighbors know each other's names, where churches outnumber grocery stores, where tragedy doesn't just affect one family, it affects everyone. And in March 2003, tragedy came to a small apartment in this community. A tragedy so unthinkable that it would force Brownsville to ask itself, how did we not see this coming? Some of the neighbors interviewed had this to say.
Angela Camacho and John Allen Rubio weren't married, but they were together. Common law partners trying to raise a family in impossible circumstances. Angela had 3 children, Julissa from a previous relationship, and John and Mary Jane, fathered by Rubio. By all accounts, these were normal kids, happy kids. Julissa loved to dance. John was full of energy. Mary Jane was just beginning to explore the world around her. But inside that apartment, behind closed doors, something was breaking. Friends and family would later say they noticed changes in Rubio. He became withdrawn, paranoid. He spoke of spiritual warfare, of demons, of possession. Mental health resources in Brownsville were minimal. There were no interventions, no hospital stays, no emergency calls to police. Just warning signs that no one knew how to read until it was too late.
When police arrived the next morning, they found a scene that would haunt even veteran investigators. 3 small bodies, 2 parents covered in blood, and a question that would echo through courtrooms for the next 23 years. Were these 2 people evil, or were they insane? The arrests came almost immediately. There was no chase, no mystery about who was responsible. Within hours, both Rubio and Camacho were in custody. What followed were confessions, direct, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Rubio spoke first. He told investigators he had been guided by voices only he could hear. He said his home had been overtaken by evil, that something inhuman had entered his family. In his mind, what he did was not murder, it was deliverance. He believed he was saving his children from something far worse. Camacho's account unfolded differently. She did not deny her role, but she described a life shaped by fear, pressure, and control. She said she felt trapped, emotionally and psychologically, that Rubio dominated every decision, that resistance felt dangerous. And when the moment came, she claimed she didn't know how to intervene, only how to survive. 2 stories, 1 crime. The investigators listened, the courts reviewed, but for the state of Texas, motives did not change the outcome. 3 children were dead, their lives ended violently, without choice, without mercy, and in the eyes of the law, explanations could not outweigh that reality. The prosecution moved swiftly. They sought the harshest punishment available, not to understand the voices, not to untangle fear or influence, but to answer one undeniable fact. 3 children had been killed, and the state intended to respond with the ultimate penalty. In Texas, murder trials can move with stunning speed. Rubio's first trial began just months after the crime. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Crime scene photographs, confessions. Some of the neighbors interviewed had this to say.
Here's what we know about the night of March 11, 2003. John Allen Rubio and Angela Camacho were alone with the children. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. No screams, no sounds of struggle. What happened inside that apartment would only be revealed through confessions, forensic evidence, and the testimony of 2 people who claimed they weren't fully in control of their actions. According to court records, both Rubio and Camacho participated in killing the children. The methods were brutal, the violence extreme, and both would later claim the same reason. They believed the children were possessed by demons.
Forensic evidence, medical examiner testimony. The defense had one argument, and that was mental illness. They brought in psychiatrists who diagnosed Rubio with schizoaffective disorder, a condition that combines symptoms of schizophrenia with mood disorders. They argued he couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. But here's the problem with that defense in Texas. Mental illness doesn't mean you're not guilty. Under Texas law, you can only avoid conviction if your mental illness prevented you from knowing right from wrong at the moment of the crime. The jury had to answer one question. Did John Allen Rubio know that killing children was wrong? The prosecution argued yes, he hid the bodies. He knew to lie to investigators. He understood consequences. The defense argued no, he was delusional. He believed he was fighting demons. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all 3 counts of capital murder. Sentence: death. Angela Camacho, on the other hand, never faced a jury. For her, she accepted her wrong, and therefore she accepted a plea deal, which is life in prison. There was no public trial, no opening statements, no verdict read aloud in a packed courtroom, no possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. Her case resolved quietly, away from the spotlight that followed Rubio. This has made many people to ask the question, why did Camacho live while Rubio was sentenced to die? Prosecutors believed the roles were not equal. They saw Rubio as the driving force, the one who initiated the violence, the one who pushed events beyond any point of return. In their view, Camacho followed rather than led. Her defense painted a different picture. They described a relationship shaped by control and fear. They pointed to patterns of domestic abuse, to emotional dependency, to a dynamic where resistance carried consequences. They argued that Camacho didn't act independently, that her judgment was eroded over time, that she existed in Rubio's shadow, psychologically tethered to his beliefs and his authority. Some experts referred to it as shared psychosis, a condition where delusions spread within close relationships, blurring responsibility and autonomy. It was a pathetic situation as the state listened, but in the end, prosecutors chose certainty over risk, a guaranteed life sentence over the unpredictability of another death penalty trial. This, the prosecutors believe, was not forgiveness, neither is it absolution, but rather it was a compromise, one that closed Camacho's case, even as questions about culpability, influence, and choice continue to linger. For Rubio, the case did not end with the verdict. In death penalty cases, the legal process continues automatically. Appeals are built into the system designed to scrutinize every step that led to a sentence of death. Rubio's attorneys began that process, combing through transcripts, jury instructions, and courtroom decisions in search of errors that might have altered the outcome. Fortunately for them, they found several. At the center of the appeal was how the jury had been guided. The instructions they received failed to clearly explain how mental illness should be considered when determining punishment. The defense also argued that Rubio's original legal representation had fallen short, leaving critical arguments underdeveloped and the evidence insufficiently presented. To the defense counsels, and these were not questions of guilt, they were questions of process. In 2007, 4 years after the original conviction, an appellate court reached a decision that few expected. The judges ruled that the sentencing phase had been flawed. Rubio's death sentence was vacated and the case was sent back to the trial court for a new punishment hearing. This caused a lot of mixed feelings in the community. For the victims' families, the ruling reopened wounds they believed had begun to heal. For prosecutors, it felt like a setback after years of work. Yet within the justice system, the decision reflected a fundamental principle. When the state seeks to take a life, the procedure must be exact. There should not be any shortcuts, neither should there be any ambiguity. As a result, John Allen Rubio was granted something rare in capital cases, another opportunity to argue against execution, not because the crime had changed, but because the law demanded fairness even in the darkest circumstances. The case was not finished, it was starting over. By July of 2010, the case returned to court. This time a different jury filled the box, but the story they were asked to hear had not changed. The same crime, the same victims, the same unanswered grief that had lingered for years. For the families, it meant reliving every detail all over again. The prosecution presented its case with the confidence of experience. Jurors were shown the same photographs taken inside the home. They listened again to the recorded confessions. Medical experts walked them through injuries that left little room for doubt. The facts, as before, were unyielding. This time, however, the defense widened its approach. They called additional specialists. Psychiatrists spoke at length about schizoaffective disorder and the way it fractures perception, judgment, and impulse control. They described a man unraveling in the months leading up to the murders, consumed by paranoia and distorted beliefs. Friends and records were introduced to show a steady mental decline, one that, according to the defense, left Rubio detached from reality when the crimes occurred. The courtroom listened, but the impact was limited. The jurors weighed the explanations against what they could see and hear for themselves. They examined the photographs. They replayed the statements. They considered the actions taken after the killings. actions that suggested awareness rather than confusion. In the end, the disorder explained his thoughts, but it did not excuse his choices. The verdict came back with grim familiarity: guilty on all counts, and the punishment is death. For the second time, the sentence was imposed. This time, it carried a finality that had been absent before. The appeals would continue, but the foundation of the conviction was stronger, the record more complete. When the courtroom emptied, there was no sense of closure. Only exhaustion, grief, and the understanding that the legal battle had entered its longest and quietest phase. This time, the ruling would stand. From 2010 through 2026, John Allen Rubio remained on death row, living inside a system measured not in days, but in filings and deadlines. During those years, his attorneys submitted appeal after appeal, challenging nearly every aspect of the case. They argued that his trial had been fundamentally unfair, that the jury never fully understood the depth of his mental illness, and that executing someone with severe psychiatric disorders crossed a constitutional line. The courts listened, and then they denied. Again and again, lower courts reviewed the arguments and came back with the same conclusion. The conviction was lawful, the sentence was valid. The process, while imperfect, met the legal standard. Each ruling closed another door, narrowing Rubio's options. As the years passed, time moved forward quietly, punctuated only by legal briefs and scheduled hearings, until the case reached its final destination. This month, it arrived at the highest court in the country. On January 12, 2026, the United States Supreme Court released its decision. There was no hearing, no written opinion, no public explanation, just a single line issued without commentary: certiorari denied. The meaning was unmistakable. The court would not intervene. The lower court rulings would stand. There would be no further review. With that decision, the long legal struggle came to an end. No more motions, no more appeals, no remaining obstacles. John Allen Rubio will be executed. The case that began with unimaginable violence now moves toward its final, irreversible conclusion.
Without a doubt, this is the most heinous, the most horrible criminal murder case in the history of Canada. The Supreme Court will agree with the Fifth Circuit that he's not entitled to appeal anymore.
When the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, Cameron County District Attorney Luis Sáenz didn't hesitate. He called the decision a victory for justice. After more than 2 decades, his office began moving forward, requesting an execution date and preparing to close one of the most disturbing cases in Texas history. From a legal standpoint, the system had done what it was designed to do. A crime was committed, a trial was held, appeals were exhausted, a sentence was affirmed. The process, slow and exhaustive, finally reached its conclusion. The irony of justice is that it is not a fixed idea. It changes depending on where one stands. For the families of Julissa, John, and Mary Jane, justice may mean something painfully simple: an end to waiting, an end to court dates, headlines, and legal uncertainty. After years of reliving the worst moment of their lives, the finality of an execution might offer something resembling peace. Not healing, not forgiveness, just the ability to move forward without another appeal reopening old wounds. For them, justice is closure. For others, this case raises a different question entirely. Mental health advocates see John Allen Rubio not only as a perpetrator, but as a warning. A man whose psychiatric condition was severe, documented, and deteriorating long before the murders occurred. They argue that the system encountered him too late, after treatment had failed, after intervention was no longer possible. They point out that schizoaffective disorder is not a character flaw. It is an illness that distorts reality, fractures perception, and can overwhelm judgment when left untreated. In their view, this case is less about punishment and more about missed opportunities for care, supervision, and prevention. They also challenge the idea of deterrence. Executions, they argue, do not prevent crimes driven by psychosis. You cannot scare someone who is disconnected from reality into behaving rationally. What capital punishment does, they say, is draw a final, irreversible line against someone who was profoundly ill long before he was violent. And yet those arguments exist alongside an undeniable truth. 3 children are dead. No diagnosis can undo that. No explanation can lessen the loss. The law must answer to victims as well as principles, to consequences as well as compassion. That tension sits at the heart of this case, unresolved and uncomfortable. Both sides believe they are defending justice. Both sides can point to evidence. Both sides can claim moral ground, and both sides will never agree. In the end, the legal system offers only one kind of resolution. It does not promise clarity. It does not promise peace. It delivers an outcome, final, enforceable, and permanent. Whether that outcome feels like justice depends entirely on who you ask, because some cases don't end with answers. They end with silence. Walk through Brownsville today, and you won't find an official monument bearing the names of Julissa, John, and Mary Jane Rubio. There are no plaques, no permanent markers sanctioned by the city, no formal memorial that tells passers-by what once happened here. But remembrance found another form. This is the site where the children once lived. 3 trees were planted in their memory. They stand quietly without signage or ceremony, growing year after year in a place once defined by violence. For those who know the story, the meaning is unmistakable. For those who don't, they are simply trees, rooted, living, and enduring. This is the location where the 3 children were killed. The original building no longer exists. In the years that followed the murders, the structure was torn down. A new building now occupies the space, serving a completely different purpose. Nothing on its exterior hints at what happened there. Life, in its own way, moved forward. But memory didn't vanish with the walls. For more than 20 years, this case has remained part of Brownsville's collective consciousness, a reminder that tragedy can unfold in ordinary homes, that severe mental illness is real, complex, and often misunderstood, that systems meant to protect families sometimes fail before help arrives. At the same time, the case helped spark difficult conversations about recognizing warning signs, about access to mental health care, about what intervention should look like before a crisis becomes irreversible. No amount of awareness can undo the loss. 3 children died, yet their names continue to surface in discussions that matter, in conversations about prevention, in debates about justice, in the uneasy space where accountability meets compassion. There is no simple ending to this story, only 3 trees quietly growing, marking a place where lives were taken, and a community that has not forgotten them. Remember the question we started with? When mental illness and murder collide, where does justice begin and where does it end? The legal system has answered, justice begins with accountability and it ends with execution. But maybe that's not the whole answer. Maybe justice also means remembering 3 children who deserved to grow up, who deserved to have their own stories, their own futures. Julissa would be 26 now, John would be 25, Mary Jane would be 23. We'll never know who they would have become, what they would have accomplished, who they would have loved. All we have left are photographs, memories, and questions that don't have easy answers. John Allen Rubio will die for what he did. The state of Texas has made that clear. But before he does, maybe we owe it to Julissa, John, and Mary Jane to ask ourselves, could we have stopped this? Could we have seen the signs? Could we have saved them? Those are the questions that matter, because the next tragedy is already forming somewhere. In some community that doesn't have the resources it needs, in some family that doesn't know how to ask for help. The question isn't whether we can prevent every tragedy. The question is, will we try?